Allow me to offer an illustrated commentary on how to produce furniture using a chainsaw and a sledgehammer. Given log stock, in this case white spruce from the forests of Eric Salatin and Bushwhack, Alaska Camp and Wiseman, north of the Arctic Circle. Fine stock. Back in New York where I play chainsaw, I've used red pine frequently. My all-time favorite wood for this purpose is white cedar, but that's not generally available. Start with a log of appropriate size, about 6 to 8 inches, 8 to 10 inches in diameter, ripping the base log in half. This process accomplished with a good, sharp, relatively powerful chainsaw done by eye. You can run a string across the area to be cut an inch or so above the actual cut, being careful not to cut the string. But eyeball and attention and good hand-eye control allow you to sever the halves of this log in a rather handy manner. A good straight cut is essential to make the surfaces of the piece of furniture conform one to the other. We'll use one piece of this large half and then rip another log to produce the second half of the base and material for the dovetail splines, which will fasten the two seat logs together. The ripping operation requires that you line the saw and the log up, drive the bar through using the bucking teeth, keeping the tip outside the bottom of the log. If you raise the tip up above, it will cut a new kerf going down and create a rough surface that requires extra planing with the chainsaw as you complete the process. One of these pieces will be used as the base, the other will put aside and mill later to serve as a spline to assemble the two base logs. Fitting the two logs, which will ultimately be the seat of the bench, together, swapping ends so that the big end, little end are lined up. This makes the total width of the bench relatively uniform. A good flat working surface is essential. Should be 6-8 inches above the ground and level enough so that it doesn't torque, twist, and take out of alignment the seat. The principle of chainsaw fitting is quite simple. Place two pieces of stock together and cut the points where they touch. Knock it together and continue that process, taking out basically a kerf width, which in the case of a 3/8 pitch chainsaw is about 3/8 of an inch. Once the high spots are removed, place the log together again. Once the fit is appropriate, the next step is to produce the mortise openings for a dovetail spline. This does require a hand-eye control and an attention, pretty close attention to the proper angles. You do need to practice this enough to get it right. The first one probably won't work. Making the angle cut with the proper taper and then a boring cut. Now beware here. The tip of that saw, if it contacts the upper quadrant, can catch the wood and cause a pretty serious kick. You do not want to be in the way. The mortise opening We're about to produce a spline that will roughly fit that dovetail opening. We use half of the log which came from the second part of the tree, just recently ripped in halves. Leave the big end sticking out, we'll work on the smaller end. These angles, intended to fit the dovetail mortise, just need to be eyeballed. I suppose you could measure with some kind of an instrument, but the process doesn't require an extreme level of accuracy. Get rid of those pieces that fall off. They tend to be tripping hazards, and if they're buried under the shavings, it can cause an unfortunate a fall upon your saw. Again, the process of chainsaw fit, two pieces of wood together, and mill a kerf width. Care necessary here. I've instructed a number of folks in this process, attempted to anyway, some successfully. This is the point at which folks cut the bench right clean in half. You need to have a sense of where the tip is, where the blade is in respect to the work you're doing. Practice, practice, and more practice really helps. It's not the recommended method of moving pieces of wood about, but it works, and if you're gentle enough, it doesn't stress the chain too badly. Once you get a fairly good fit, all pieces flush together, you bring into usage the second implement necessary for the process of this style of chainsaw furniture assembly, a heavy hammer. The wood needs to be green in order to work nicely in this manner, and it actually the joints will compress and conform one to the other if the wood is relatively soft. There is the finished dovetail spline, a strong joint and quite durable. The second cut positioned, in this case, a bit in from the end. There will be an armrest mortised into the end of the log. Boring cut to take out the mortise pieces. Another dovetail mortise and the second piece of timber stock to produce the tapered dovetail spline. This particular spline fit a little bit better than the first one. Occasionally, if luck prevails, it pops exactly into place and doesn't need any trimming, but that's rare. For this operation, a fresh, crisp chain and a fresh, crisp bar allow the process to proceed much more efficiently. Worn chain and bar do not follow a true line. They'll kind of wobble around and make life difficult for you if you're trying to fit pieces together. As long as gravity prevails and friction is present, these things will stay together. Boring the mortise openings for the legs. The bottom quadrant of that tip enters the wood first. That minimizes the chance for kickback. There's no way to eliminate it. Cutting a little window in the side of the previous kerf, rolling the saw parallel to the kerf, and cutting out one kerf width of material at a time works a lot better, I've found, than attempting to cut one side of the mortise and then the other and then take the middle out. 5 kerf widths seem to be about right for the leg mortise opening. The angle which is used to bore through determines the angle that the leg will take. The back of the bench needs to be positioned so that it doesn't tip over too readily. The back legs should splay out a bit to provide stability end to end, and back to prevent the whole bench from tipping over if somebody sits on it. There's that little window carved, and drive the saw in swiftly, smartly. Chisel chain only. Safety chain does not work for boring cuts very well. They're a lot safer with the low kick tendency, but they don't slide into the wood as smoothly as a chisel chain. There is a tendency for the saw to walk forward. That chain provides a forward force that would cause the one kerf to walk ahead of where the previous one was positioned. It's necessary to be in charge of the saw. You do what you want. Don't let the saw decide what it wants to do. Planing, smoothing, squaring. The fourth of the mortise openings for the legs. For some reason, I've found it's easier to stand up on the material to do this in this one particular leg. That's a big saw. It's a steel MS-660. If I'm in a hurry and showing off a little bit, I can finish a bench of this design in less than half an hour with a big saw. With a small saw, it takes an hour and a half minimum to do a bench this size. Producing legs from round stock of appropriate size. It does need to be larger in diameter by an inch or two than the height of the bar, the width from top to bottom, in order to produce a tenon that will fit those mortise cuts that we've just produced. Rip the log in half, leaving part of it intact. Saw at the appropriate angle, and again, hand-eye control and a sense of how things should fit together. It's a puzzle sort of a thing, but you're in charge of the product and the angles that are produced. You can measure it first. That tends to slow things down a little bit, and with a practiced eye, you can come fairly close to making a good fit. We sever the two halves from the stock. And if you've done a decent job fitting the mortises, the legs will slide into place and are at this point ready for persuasion with the second tool, the big heavy hammer. Second pair of legs, which will be the front of the bench, can be a little shorter. The angles don't splay out as much from side to side or forward into the point where they're going to interfere with your feet when you're sitting down in a relaxed mode on a bench. A good platform to whittle in this manner is very helpful. There should have been a notch under that log to prevent it from rolling around as much as it does. The middle cut and the side cuts need to be parallel one to the other. The angle of this particular cut is important. It should be fairly steep so that when the legs are driven into the mortises, the edges come tight before the flatter faces. That minimizes the tendency to split the whole bench in half. These act as much like a wedge, and if you overdo it, you'll end up with more pieces of wood than you wanted. Enter the sledgehammer. You do the hammer dance here most effectively by standing on the bench. 3 pretty good hits on the soft green wood to start with. You got to hit it to get it. Hit it enough to bring it up tight, wait a minute, then give it another good shot. The sap squeezes out of the wood after the first 3 and gives you a little bit more. Pounding too much renders the base into one big split. Okay, these have come through enough. If they didn't quite make it through, I'd have to knock it out, enlarge the mortise hole, or plane a little bit off the side of the leg. Both work. We're now eyeballing the leg extensions, cutting what should be fairly close to 4 legs on the ground. You really do not know where the bench is going to be installed, but perhaps you do, but the surface of the ground is not going to be level. Once the bench is upright and supposedly standing on 4 legs, you can kick a hole with your heel under the long one and make a nice stable platform. To put it on a hard, solid, true surface requires much more care, and it's quite difficult to get all 4 legs exactly the same. The front legs were obviously a bit too long. Trim those off and wiggle it around to make it look fairly level. Removing the protruding tenons from the leg stock is done quite simply, blade parallel to the surface. It is possible to fill the gaps with wedges to make it appear a little bit neater and actually hold the legs a little bit. Contouring the ends of the bench to make it conform with a concept of a seat, a chair. Smoothing the edges. Run the bar at an angle to take off what is a sharp edge, and that underneath your legs it's not quite as comfortable as a nice rounded surface. In the process too, cut off the extended dovetail spline there. That doesn't need to be sticking out where you're going to be sitting. Contouring the right-hand edge of the bench, rounding off the bottom, aesthetic improvement. Trimming the edges, using the chain in such a manner that it's going away from the wood, minimizes the splintering that occurs if you were to cut that particular item with the chain coming toward the end of the bench. Little extra trim on one of the leg mortises coming through. Now, boring cuts, 4 more mortises, 2 for the armrests and 2 for the upright back supports. The same process. Boring cut, bottom of the bar starts in. Hold on to that saw, thumb over the grip, elbows against your side. Make sure it doesn't kick on you. The depth gauges on the chain cannot be too deep, but the factory settings of a new chain, the steel model chisel chain, to my mind, is just about perfect for this operation as it comes out of a little plastic box. One kerf width at a time, move them aside. Get 4 kerf widths in the back supports, and the supports for the armrest seems to be sufficient. Wafting the saw back and forth to square it up, take away the rough edges. The angle of the mortise obviously will determine the angle of the back support. Getting them to fit the concept of a comfortable chair and match human anatomy takes a little practice. It is good if both angles are identical. You don't get a crooked back on the item. The last mortise opening for the armrests. Square it up. The dovetail splines at this point are far too long now that we've established the position of the mortise. These can be trimmed to minimize the counterbalance to make the bench fall over backwards. A little bit of planing, light touch, high chain speed, not quite parallel to the grain. If you go right parallel, it'll bite right in and make a divvy you don't want to see. Buzzing off the excess on the splines, and then take a moment to round off the edges, aesthetic purposes. Being careful not to trip over pieces. This should take time to clean up the tripping hazards as you go. Manufacturing, milling the supports for the back, a tapered tenon, an angle cut to remove the little short slabs to conform with the angle of the back as it will be set into the top of the bench. There is a risk in dealing with small pieces of wood in this manner. If the chain catches the piece and it's able to move, it can flick it right into your shin leg quite smartly. When possible, oops, we ran out of gas. It does take about 1.5 tanks to build a bench with the back and arms. In green spruce, oak takes about 3 tanks of gas. Producing the dovetail shape here to take the dovetail mortises that will be cut into the back. These If all is as intended, these fit nicely into the mortise cuts, and tap them home firmly. Don't overdo this or you'll end up with too many pieces of bench not holding together. Let the juice run out a little bit, hit them again. We're now ready to produce a back for the bench, a backrest, using the large half of the very first log. Position this in front of the upright supports to give you a visual measure of the width of the mortise cuts. The proper angle, this is a compound angle. It's tipped in two different directions. It does require some practice, but once you master it, it happens quite handily. That's not the recommended way for moving pieces of wood. And in fact, if you're not careful and somebody's watching in that direction, they can get clobbered with a moving chain-launched fragment. I counted the pieces of wood that come off such a bench at one point, and it approaches 70 tiny chunks. They burn pretty well if you let them dry. Most of them go into a compost pile. Ready to fit that double dovetail mortises over the upright tenons. Once you get it started, you simply cut the touching faces 3/8 of an inch at a time, the kerf width of a 3/8 pitch saw chain, and it starts to let it in, let it down right onto the uprights. The left side was higher to start with than the right side, but we're now torquing the force on the right hand end. It's going to pop back up here in a second. Now we've got to work on the other end a bit, get it to go down a little bit on each end to keep it roughly parallel to the seat. It settles right in. Sometimes it bites your chain a bit, but this is one situation where a big powerful saw such as this MS660 is a little bit cumbersome to hold up. I've tried to do this for a long day, and with a big saw I'm whipped at the end of a day. But the payoff is the speed of the bigger, more powerful saw. 3 or 4 times as fast as a smaller saw. Not to be hurried, though. This isn't a race. Once it's fit on pretty well and down to about the right height, you can customize these things for big people or little people by adjusting the height of the back. Clobber it into place, and then you're ready to contour the top, the back to make it more comfortable for a piece of furniture. Chain outboard motion there keeps the splinters from being pulled away. We now have a half log with a sharp edge at the bottom and the top. This is easily removed. Take a little angle off there to give a somewhat greater level of comfort to somebody lounging against the back of it. Cutting the protruding spline off, contouring the end of the handle. Many different angles you can do here, but the idea is to round it off and make it comfortable, and try to make it look nice. It is, yes indeed, it is an art form. Trimming the top edge of the half log provides for a little bit more comfort. Get rid of that dovetail spline. The last step in the operation is to bruce the armrests. The upright supports little pieces of wood and maximize the risk of catching one of those pieces of wood with the chain and flinging it right at you. Eye protection, the chaps, hard hat. I think you're not too far away from insane if you operate a chainsaw without complete safety equipment. I clobbered my chainsaw chaps with that one, lightly. Producing the characteristic dovetail. If ever you've operated a chainsaw, you know full well that hard rock mining, digging the nose of that thing into the dirt, is not a good idea. A nice, crisply sharp chain, I like to do it, the final touches by hand with a well-worn file and lighten up on the last few strokes. It makes for a nice sharp. That one ding in the ground will take the edge off every one of the 32 cutter teeth on a 20-inch chain. In fact, that 20-inch bar is the appropriate length to my mind. Now here the bar is positioned so that if it should catch that base, it would kick right at me. I'm very well aware of that. Here's a little chunk poised to pounce upon my shin if I don't do it properly. The last of the uprights for the armrest. This one is way too long. It's going to have to be trimmed, but at this stage it's possible to bring them up tight. Hopefully they come tight before they bottom out. Whittle that thing down to size. I'm going to redo the dovetail angles, but that's not a huge challenge. Getting the angles right is probably the single biggest challenge, not only for the dovetail mortise and tenon operation, but the legs and back and armrests have angles involved, and it's just a kind of a pragmatic thing. If it works, do it again. The armrest, the dovetail mortise here is a compound angle. You're well able to fix slight irregularities here, but it's good to have it fairly close to right to start with. Eyeball the length necessary for the second one, move over, cut the second dovetail mortise. Beware of the boring cut, the plunge cut. This is the situation where that saw can come flying at you. 7 times faster than the best athlete can react, and if you're in the way, you get hit. Saw chain makes a nasty wound. It doesn't make a nice slice the way an axe does. It takes out chunks. Get that dovetail mortise and tenon to start. Common principle here, cutting the 2 surfaces that need to be brought into conformity. Make a kerf parallel to both. Being careful not to go into the armrest chunk itself. But every kerf removed allows it to drop down 1/2 inch or so. Let it in, let it go down till it reaches the proper height. It's pretty close right there. That should do it. Not recommended to use a chainsaw for a hammer, but a light touch probably won't hurt the mechanism too badly. There is one component to this operation that is worth noting. I'm left-handed, which is actually against OSHA rules. If you're left-handed, you're supposed to operate a chainsaw right-handed. With left-handed operation, the plane of rotation lines up with your body, and if you get a kickback, it comes towards your body. The plus side of that, though, is that your eye and the bar are lined up, and you don't have as great a tendency to cut out the angle wrong. Again, we're depending on friction and gravity here, some of the more reliable forces that we have to contend with every day. Contouring the armrest so that it's appropriate. Rolling that saw as it cuts makes for a nice round finish, but it's really tough on the bar and chain. When you make a few pieces of furniture, you find that the bar groove gets worn to be much wider and the chain tangs get thin at the bottom, and the chain tends to roll, and that's difficult to make it follow a cut if it's flopping around inside the bar groove. A crisp new bar and crisp new chain solve a lot of problems. One of the desirable features of folks ordering a bench from me, they want me to cut a beer can holder in the armrest. Doesn't really make a neat insertion with a chainsaw, but well, we don't need to do that here. And that rolling motion of the bar makes a nice round cut, but and the very last cut. Nothing to it. Yeah, one of my most reliable friends.